everyone. My name is Andrew Watkins-Alcocer. I'm a doctoral student from the studio Mark Kellogg, and this is my final lecture recital. Tonight we're going to be talking about recomposing Brookmeyer, but essentially the aspects of his compositions broken down into modules. So essentially taking important parts of a piece and repurposing them and recontextualizing them to get new material. So that first piece that you heard was called King Porter 94. So it's essentially King Porter Stomp. For those of you who don't know jazz much, King Porter Stomp is arguably one of the more important ragtime pieces, jazz pieces, sometimes referred to as the birth of jazz. So that was written by Jelly Roll Morton. This version was written in 1994 and actually came out on the album Waltzing with Zoe in 2001. So a bit of background information. Like I said, it's based on Jelly Roll Morton's King Porter Stomp. So ragtime, a lot of downbeat oriented, very transparent harmonies, beginnings of swing fill and that sort of thing. But it's distinctly not an arrangement, but referring to it more as a recomposition. So essentially taking the devices, taking the ideas from the original composition and pulling them apart to be able to recompose or reconstruct a new piece of music. And I think it's just a very revealing kind of piece of most of Brookmeyer's writing style from across multiple time periods. So a piece that you'll hear from us later is called Ho Hum, and basically at the end of the day, a lot of it's just based on movements of thirds. What's interesting about King Porter Stomp and KP94 is a lot of it is the same idea, even though they're written about 45 years apart. So the manipulation of intervals, the manipulation of ideas, and the manipulation of different aspects of music rather than just I'm going to arrange a melody. So a few features about the piece that you just heard. Again, that's from 2001 KP94 or King Porter 94. It shows a lot of really expert awareness of intervallic content and their developments. So by that, essentially what I mean is in King Porter Stomp, there's specific intervals, specific melodic devices that you might hear, and this is an awareness of them to the level of not just direct statement, but actually taking them and repurposing them. And being aware of the ways that that would work rather than just saying, I'm going to arrange the melody around this and that'll be fine. It's just like, no, an actual awareness of why the intervals work the way they do, kind of the affect behind the intervals. There's an incredible ingenuity in melodic and harmonic development of it. Obviously, hearing the beginning part of the King Porter 94, the first thing that we heard was the chromatically moving bass lines and kind of the chromatic lines in the saxophones. The reason why that works so well is because there's so much transparency in what's going on and so much harmonic distinction to what's going on. So we're not necessarily building it in the sense of, oh, here's a 1, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1 or whatever. It's linear voice leading, linear harmonics. There's an incredible display of virtuosity in the composition and orchestration. So Brookmeyer being the genius orchestrator that he was, there was no issue orchestrating something as complex as that piece. And everything's divided pretty evenly. So a lot of that piece, you'll hear the trombones on the slower moving stuff, saxophones on some of the more melodic, some of the more complex stuff, and then the trumpets might be on some of the more climactic figures. So very basic principles of orchestration, but a lot of it is related to just how transparent you can make something that's complex. And you can see, even though it doesn't sound like a traditional jazz head at all, there's just a lot of flow and a lot of momentum. And I think that's probably the largest guiding principle for a lot of this music is, does this feel good? And does it sound good as it's progressing? So to talk a little bit about arrangement versus a recomposition, arrangements typically feature settings in the melody. So for that, you might hear something on probably the most basic level, what we would call a head chart. So essentially taking the head of a piece and orchestrating it, whether it be with different instruments, so adding maybe some harmonies to it or adding extra notes to the melody, and then adding behind it hits, counterlines, or anything like that, anything you can do to spice up the melody. Then there's further additions that you can add to it. So in the case of, for example, Brookmeyer has another version of King Porter Stomp from 1958, I think it is, and it's an octet version, where the original melody is very transparent, it's very clear, but there's more additions to it. So there's more counterlines, more kind of repurposing of the material, so it's not necessarily in the sense of just a head chart, it's an actual idea of like, oh, how can I develop this and bring this into the new age? Another version past that is actually recontextualizing the material to an extent where it's still related, but it has a personal touch. So if anyone here is familiar with Gil Evans' arrangement of King Porter Stomp from New Bottle Old Wine, features Cannonball Adderley, the beginning melody is actually never entirely stated. It's more so just implied throughout the piece. So there's further and further developments on it from that. And then we would get something like this, which we can't almost call an arrangement anymore, and that's where we get to recompositions. So utilizing materials found in dissection and analysis of a piece to inform and generate new melodic and harmonic materials. So we'll discuss in a few about how that was done, but essentially what's happening is that he's taking specific elements, the characteristic things, and if you want to call it almost essentially the musical DNA of a piece, and finding a new evolution, finding a new development of those ideas. So the last bit is just, this can either be recognizable or not. So when I say recognizable, when you listen to this piece, knowing King Porter Stomp, if you listen to KP94, you probably didn't hear it at all. It's almost not there. But the affect of it guided the composition. So and then there's other principles about it being recognizable. So in a little bit, we'll be playing another piece. Actually, at the end of this, we'll be playing another piece where parts of the original piece are recognizable. So you'll kind of see the difference in that. So to briefly talk about why this piece was created, because again, it's almost jarring in a way to call it King Porter Stomp, but at the same time, there's a reason. So it was originally composed for Fred Sturm's book, Changes Over Time, The Evolution of Jazz Arranging, which is a tremendous book. It's essentially another version of Ray Wright's book, Inside the Score, just in a more progressive manner, written in the 90s. So taking original pieces, so for example, there was another piece in the book called Chant of the Weed that was also rearranged. Fred had people like Brookmeyer and Jim McNeely also wrote new versions of pieces for this book. And it's really tremendous because it breaks down all the different aspects, all the different little ideas that went into the new composition. So in Sturm's words, the study was conceived to illustrate through comparative case studies the dramatic development of rhythmic, melodic, harmonic, orchestrational, and structural variation in jazz arranging from the 1920s to present. So there's a great part of the book where it actually talks about the development specifically of King Porter Stomp, going from the original Jelly Roll Morton to Fletcher Henderson's version with Benny Goodman to Gil Evans' version, and then finally to this final version. And also Brookmeyer's octet version from the 50s. So it breaks down why those developments work and how they kind of relate to what's going on outside of it. So it's a really great book if anyone gets the chance. It's in the Sibley Library. And the reason specifically for picking, I guess, this version of King Porter Stomp to analyze is because it again, is the most jarring to me. It's the most striking. And it has kind of the most ingenuity in the way that someone would actually approach composition. I think there's so much to be learned from taking material from the standpoint of development rather than arrangement. So that's where that differentiation comes from. So to discuss a bit about the construction of the piece, sorry, if you guys want to sit down, there's some seats open up here. I don't smell, I promise. So the construction of the piece was aimed to be uninfluenced by previous versions. So there's a quote from Brookmeyer coming up later about this, but essentially, during the construction of the piece, not listening to any other version of it, period. Not looking at any other version, and instead just being informed by the written material. So in this case, the first published version of King Porter Stomp, I think, was what was used. From there, taking that material and dissecting it into modules, or you can call them cells if you want, which are essentially just the individual aspects of a piece that become really important. So either it's the first idea of a melody, a rhythm that might work really well, some type of voice leading. And we'll go through some of these aspects as well, but trying to think of a piece not in the sense of this is what it sounds like, but this is what it's made of. So the modules then allowed him to vent in more independent material. So essentially, instead of taking, here's a melody, I'm going to arrange it, here's a melody, here's what makes the melody, how do I generate a new one from it? So it's planting a seed in the ground, but not necessarily knowing what plant is going to come up, but you got it from a pack of oranges. So it might be an orange, it might not be. And because of this, it also lets him be more concerned with flow and motion. So from that excerpt of the piece you just heard, it just has this constant movement, constant never stopping. You don't always get that with just like head arrangements because you almost get rid of that flow sometimes. And something like this, in the recontextualization of the material, you're able to just keep moving. And I think that's what's really striking about this piece sometimes. So that's a picture of Bob. And in his words, my view on recreating standard material is fairly absolute. I take apart the song for units of meaning, the modules, and then begin to form a view or a picture of how I feel at that moment about the piece. There's another quote I didn't include here, but where he briefly talked about butchering standards in his arrangements, and I think that's ultimately why he may have gone with this approach, but I think it's really interesting because he has so many arrangements of standards that are just tremendous, and then to generate something like this from the want to not butcher it is kind of funny to me. But that's what we end up getting. We're getting a piece like this from that. So these are the devices that essentially came out of looking at the original King Porter stomp and that were used to recreate or recontextualize and then develop KP94. So the first one of which being the idea from the first strain of the piece. So if you've heard King Porter stomp, it's essentially the first melody after the introduction. We can see in it has that major second intervallic relationship, and that opens up a lot of possibilities. So you can take it as just the idea of a major second movement, the idea of an intervallic movement between voices, the idea of a repeated rhythm or a repeated note going to and from. So that opens up a lot of different things. So in KP94, it was later augmented to fourths and fifths. The left-hand movement in the beginning melody, or the first strain of King Porter Stomp, is also important. So that's how you get that major fifth interval. So sometimes descending, later ascending by step. And the reason why that's important is because it's a really transparent, really strong harmonic device. And when he begins to develop it in the piece, it's less in the context of like, okay, when we look at this, we have. Do you mind if I play some piece? The initial statement essentially going A flat to G flat with G flat 6 to F7. So this movement is giving us a distinct harmonic movement, but we don't have to take it like that. We can take it as an intervallic movement of notes harmonized at the fifth. And that opens up a bit more possibilities about why we would want to look at it that way. The next one is a rhythmic device. So it's the Charleston rhythm, which I think almost every jazz person knows. It's essentially that 1, 2, 3, 4. Everyone knows it, it's jazz. That's all over the place. And it almost doesn't feel like it because of the way that it's stylistically played, but it is an informing factor about how you can use a rhythm and develop it. So another way that this rhythm is actually developed is misplacing, I get to use the laser thing, misplacing this second part of it and instead creating an ostinato from the dotted quarter note. So there's a section towards the end of the excerpt that we just played where the melody is essentially just movements of dotted quarters over and over and over again going across the bar line. And that's really interesting because it finally resolves by using this rhythm. So it's essentially an augmentation of the Charleston rhythm without explicitly implying it until the very end. So it's kind of a neat little device and very manipulative. The third strain, so this is the trio section of the piece, was one of the other places. And this is interesting to me because we, again, thinking about pieces not necessarily in the context of major and minor, harmonic movement or anything, we can begin to look at stuff like this as if it's a collection of pitches rather than an explicit this is D flat major, D flat minor. So when we look at this, we could say it's D flat major, and that E natural is a sharp 9 resolving up to the F and then back down to the D flat. So in Fred Sturm's book, Brookmeyer actually stated that the E natural sounded old-fashioned to him. So what ended up happening was that there was a replacement of the pitch of just saying F flat. So the blue note seemed to impede the flow a little bit to him, so instead it's just deciding this is going to be the phi pitch collection. So material was eventually reduced to just a descending minor scale, so going A flat, G flat, F flat, E flat, D flat, and becoming a melodic cell. And the reason why I say descending minor scale rather than flipping it and just making it an ascending scale, how we might always look at it, is because it's more so the idea of that these pitches are ordered, not in an atonal sense, but just in a sense of this isn't existing within major or minor. They're just ordered and they inform the way that some melodic device can be formulated. The shout figure is another important aspect. For example, when I was talking about the dotted quarter note that was placed over the bar line creating an ostinato, that's similar to actually what's happening in the shout figure. So this is used in the second statement of the melody that we heard in KP 94, but you can see it's that sharp 9 going down to the tonic 9 tonic, and it's just a 2-beat rhythm, a rest, and then another 2-beat rhythm. So essentially going over the bar line. That basically just informs a rhythmic device of you can create an ostinato off of this, and also a melodic device of ways that you can get back to the tonic. The interlude figure is another important one, where this isn't necessarily used in an aspect of implicitly stating this ever, what part of any of this is, but essentially what it does is help to break up 4 and 8 bar symmetrical phrases. So a lot of this is, you would be hard-pressed to count just a 4-bar phrase in the piece that we just heard. And sometimes it's a manipulation of this rhythm, where in the original piece we have the first 2 strains and then we have this interlude, right? And it breaks up the whole thing of the piece. It has the same sort of meaning, but in a bit of a different context and is recontextualized. I think everyone knows this rhythm. If you have one of the figure sheets that were over there, something got messed up and it says like E sharp, G sharp over F minor. Sorry about that, I'm not sure what happened. It's supposed to be this. It's figure 7 on your sheets. But this is that second strain figure that I think everyone's kind of familiar with, the ba-da-ba-doo-da, 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 if you know the piece at all. So this opens up the possibility of moving to of a section in relative minor, not the. So moving to relative minor or some sort of movement by third to a different key. So and it's important to differentiate between the two. So to discuss a little bit about how these were applied, that initial major second interval, you hear a lot of different times with the kind of the longer figures in KP 94, moving up from C to D or whatever version of it is, but it's an explicit, it's really implying that major second. So another one being the open fifths, a lot of the bass, the trombones, so the bass trombone and the third trombone will sometimes be in fifths with each other, moving in similar ways. So you can see actually moving from G flat to A flat and D flat to E flat, so fifths moving in seconds. So it's the second principle, or the second element and the first element at the same time. And what's interesting is that both of those elements so far use that Charleston rhythm. So we're getting kind of a combination of all those aspects together to generate this phrase, entirely informed by the original material, but in a totally different context now. So the fourth element is that melodic cell, the descending minor scale. And that becomes interesting because it's used in a lot of different places. But for example, in this place where we see this phrase going E, D, C sharp, B, A, and then back to B, we can't really say that it's A major or B minor in any regard. The pitch preceding this is F sharp, that's why I placed it there. But essentially what it's saying is that this is a collection of pitches that informs the way that a melody can be derived. So the flow of the line being more important. It's less important if it's specifically in A major or B minor or anything similar to that. That cross rhythm that we were talking about from the shout section pops up here as well. So this was coming from measure 10, one of the first melodies that you hear in the piece, where it's the same 4-note collection, slightly different in the way that it's presented, but then moving consistently over the bar line to create that same sort of ostinato figure. And then the interlude figure, it appears a lot of different times. One of the most heavily implied times is from later in the piece in measure 105, where it's not necessarily the same shape, it's a similar shape, but what's happening is that it's actually kind of breaking things up and allowing for the line to flow a bit more. So there's something that happens after it, but really what it's doing is helping things get to a point without having just the same thing over and over again. And you can see that it's a similar shape and kind of the same, almost the similar tonal area as well. And that the second string figure, moving to the melodic minor, it's interesting because we at one point do move to E flat minor, which relative minor, not melodic minor. We do move to E flat minor, but it's not necessarily in the sense of like, oh, we're using this to go into the 6th of the key or anything like that. It's just a tonal movement to a new area. And it's kind of interesting because it's almost the same rhythmic shape. So if you're looking at that first one, the F, A flat, C, F, A flat, we're going A flat, F, A flat, F, then D flat. So it's moving the shape around a little bit to get to a new area. So this next piece that we're going to play is called Ho Hum, and this is from his album called Gloomy Sunday and Other Bright Moments. And I actually found out about this earlier this week. 2 things. One, this album is now on YouTube, so you can actually find this whole album in really good audio quality as well. So I highly suggest it. It's an incredible album. And 2, when I was kind of looking for info on this piece, I found a piece called Ain't Got a Dime to My Name, Ho Hum. It's from a movie called Road to Morocco. You can find this on YouTube as well, where it's not entirely in the context of what we're talking about here, but the part of the refrain of the piece is the vocalist singing ho hum, ho ho hum, and it's incredibly similar to the beginning phrase of this melody. So, Dave, I actually kind of want to talk to you about this later because I have a question. But essentially, it's really similar. It's kind of interesting. But anyways, that's an aside. So this is Ho Hum from 1961. One. world. Yeah, so that's Ho Hum. I just think it's really important because it kind of shows a lot of different aspects of his writing that was really on display from that time period, but oddly enough, I think on display from a lot of different time periods as well. So the development of intervals, the development of rhythms, how things coincide with each other, they don't get lost with age, and you can almost hear that from the first piece that we played, so KP 94. Some of those elements are still there. So the reason why I'm kind of discussing all the aspects from KP 94 is because I think it's also important to not only just learn what they are, but to implement them. So the piece that we'll be hearing in a few minutes is actually another piece called HH22 that I wrote in homage to KP 94 based on Ho Hum. So, and kind of developed in the same manner as KP 94 was developed from King Porter Stomp. So to do this, it was important to identify the meaningful aspects of the original piece in the same manner. So this allows me to formulate intervallic cells that guide the harmonic aspects, analyze root movement for voice leading possibilities, identify important rhythmic schemes for development, and find relevant tonal areas and relationships. So again, that major and relevant minor, or relative minor, or different relationships like that. So the first thing that I pulled out from Ho Hum was the intervallic cells. And again, these are cells, you can refer to them as modules as well. They can be analyzed in the same manner as Brookmeyer's 3-note module is constructed. So if you have any experience studying with Dave on that, it's a really great system, I think, for composition, but also for analysis. And it's essentially looking at intervals between pitches. It's a lot more than that, but for the purposes of right now, it's intervals between pitches. I essentially derived this from the initial melody of the piece. So think of it almost as like a melodic genesis. So the next aspect was the root movement. So this can be derived from bass lines, chord progressions, etc. In this new piece, at one point, we play exactly the same chord changes that you heard on Ho Hum, but they're totally recontextualized so they don't feel like they're in the same place. Another thing that you might hear is, for example, that moving bass line that was in the trombones at the beginning of the piece. That is also present, but in a totally different way. So it doesn't have to be stated directly, but it's kind of used as a compositional device. It's like, here's something to inform what we can do in the future. The other thing that's important is rhythmic schemes. So for example, from King Porter Stomp in KP 94, the Charleston rhythm. Oddly enough, that pops up here as well. So that was actually probably the most guiding principle that I had for rhythmic figures in the new piece as well. So it keeps going further. Charleston is just jazz. So it's similar to the use of the rhythm, and the goal was to find the fundamental schemes that retain the identity of certain aspects of the piece. So that while that rhythm is probably the most important one, another one was some bouncing 8-note figure that appears. It actually appears in Ho Hum right before the trombone solo. And the reason why I thought that was important was because it's very distinct in the piece and it can be recontextualized. Everyone's heard some sort of John Cagey sort of thing where there's just a repeated rhythm. It always sounds the same, but it always sounds different. So it's that same sort of idea about using things again. The tonal areas were a bit more important. I took a bit more concern towards this than the initial KP 94 versus King Porter Stomp. I wanted something, this piece being in D flat major, I wanted it to kind of retain that quality for a large part of it and still get away from it, but still have that element of recognition in the piece. And this kind of also informs how the piece may move harmonically or where eventually the tonic may lie. So while this piece is in D flat major, you don't get a real sense of D flat until actually the very note, and you'll hear that when we play this new piece. But it's essentially more the idea about wanting to have something to hover around a tonal area rather than saying, again, this is a 1, 6, 2, 5 or something. Like, that's not necessarily the idea. It's more so about trying to get there eventually. So let's take a look at the primary melody of Ho Hum. This is figure 14 if you have the sheets. So to me, this was kind of awesome because there's so many different things going on. Rhythmic, harmonic, intervallic. There's just a lot of stuff in there. So that first thing being the movement between the F and the D flat, that major third. And then the second statement of the melody We see it again, but it's a G flat to the E flat because it's essentially the same melody but moved up by a step. So we have that first rhythm that's essentially misplaced Charleston rhythm in a way, but coming in syncopated on the end of one, and then finally coming in on the downbeat, syncopated, downbeat, syncopated, downbeat, syncopated, downbeat. So it's kind of interesting how there's this pattern forming. So thinking about patterns in rhythm and trying to find different ways to work with them. But for the purposes of also for time, I'll move on. So the use of intervals in ho-hum appears to be kind of important. Again, the piece is in D flat major, so it's very easy to say that, oh, well, I'm just going to use all the intervals from D flat major scale being whole steps and half steps, but that's not necessarily the case here. The thing that informs it most is probably this movement from between the first two notes, a major third. So in just a scale, just the intervals of a scale, you don't have a major third movement. But in this movement of the melody, there is a major third. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And then same thing, the secondary row, so the second statement, there's this movement of a minor third. So these are important intervals, which you don't just get any thirds from just thinking about it in a major or a minor scale. So this is the way it was kind of modified. And I was trying to think of it in the sense of, for one, introducing a minor second into it, because I thought that was important for what I was kind of going after melodically, but also trying to think of aspects of like, okay, I don't want this to sound diatonic. I don't want it to sound as just being in a scale. I do want it to have a chromatic aspect. But how can I introduce a chromatic aspect while still retaining the ideas of the intervals that were present in the previous row? So this line, now essentially in like a D flat minor, and D minor, and essentially moving around, is derived essentially from those intervals, and also the original line. So you can see in 17 and 18, there's now relevant pitches, but it's divided into 3-note modules. So that first one, instead of it just being a D flat major scale, we have the pitch collection of 3 notes. So this is figure 18, the bottom one, where we have a minor third between the 2 outer notes, a major second between the first and second, and a minor second between the second and third. And then continuing that, but still using the original notes from the original melody, we get the same formation starting on D. So major second up to E, minor second from E to F, minor third. And then when I was going through and trying to find ways to develop this, I somehow got onto the idea of using a note to pivot things. So that's where the G flat comes into play. And again, not necessarily referring you to the fourth of D flat major, but more as like, oh, this is an idea to pivot things around. So when the G flat becomes present, we switch to a major third up to that B flat, a minor third from the G flat to the A, and a minor second up to the A flat, from the A to the B flat. And then also retaining from the ending note that original cell. So going down from C to A, a minor third, C to B flat, major second, and B flat to A, minor second. So using a collection of all those intervals to generate a new row derived from the initial melody. The second statement in the melody ends up doing the same thing. So having, instead of a minor third, we're now using that major third collection that we generated with the G flat. So D, F, G flat, and keeping that again. So this one has a G flat in it, but we'll use that to address in a second. So E up to the A flat, so major third, and same thing with the minor third and minor second. And then once the G flat pops up, shifting back to the initial cell, so minor third, major second, and then finally minor third, major second, minor second. So it kind of acts as a pivot note, but we're still using these collections of intervals to generate a new melody. To quickly address parts of the harmonic movement of the piece, this is the original bass line that we see in ho-hum, so that kind of raucous trombone figure that's going on in the beginning. So starting on the A flat, kind of a pedal 5 in D flat, and then moving up chromatically to a B flat, going up an octave, and then coming down to a C, 2-5 into D flat, and that's how we get the relative minor, and then finally coming down to an E flat at the end. So I wanted to take something similar to this idea and actually develop it in a way similar to the KP94, which was the first thing that I was thinking of, a chromatically moving bass line that has a kind of constant color above it. And what that ended up being was something like this. So using that initial A flat, same movement up to a B flat, and then I added a tone in there for chromatic tones because I wanted to just keep a chromatic line, and then continue it down, repeating some of these notes just because it helped the phrase a bit, and then down to a D flat finally. So that's how we got to our tonic. And then just a chromatic ascent all the way back up to the top for B flat so we can get to a new section. So the added colors above it are just mainly either diminished or sometimes melodic minor. It depends. I mainly planed the notes, so kept them moving chromatically with the bass note, sometimes changing it to accent the notes above. But essentially the idea was to try to get a constant color underneath and just have that continually moving. We'll hear a set of ostinato figures in a few in the piece as well that takes after the ostinato figures that you hear in KP94. They're kind of an interesting construction because in KP94 you might hear something like this. So this piece still being in D flat, I wanted to say, okay, D flat, we're going to move to the 5. But I didn't want to just have a 5th movement. So instead, trying to think of ways to kind of obscure that, so I'll play it up here. One of the more important intervals from those initial rows was the movement of a minor second. So instead of moving by a major second like KP94 did, moving by a minor second into the A flat, that's how I got the A natural. And then trying to think of fifths, but just inversions of them. So just moving to a 4th instead. And then retaining that major second interval. So it's essentially moving in contrary motion by major and minor seconds into the 5 of D flat, but in inversion, so it's A flat over E flat. And I just thought this was a nice way to reintroduce those elements back into the piece without actually stating them directly. So movements of fifths are very recognizable, but this is just a way to manipulate them around. The first thing that we'll hear after the introduction of the piece is this trombone melody. And just for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip this and move to kind of the explanation of it. But it's essentially movements of thirds now. So we use seconds for the bass line. Now we're using thirds for the melody. So those first 2 pitches, you can see it on the sheet, can't really see it here. F, D flat, first 2 pitches of ho-hum. G flat, E flat, first 2 pitches of the second phrase of ho-hum. And then just developments of them further. So always using thirds, major third, minor third, and then essentially a free choice of moving into a minor second between the D flat and C, and then going forward from there. The second line does the same thing, but starting with different notes. The third line does the same thing, but with the addition of a major second. And the fourth line does the same thing, but with the addition of a perfect fourth. The reason for this wasn't just like, oh, well, this makes sense, kind of, for flow-wise. Well, it does make sense for flow. The idea was collections of intervals within form. So, for example, those first 2 lines were mainly from major, minor thirds, and major seconds. So let's call them A, A. The third one introducing a minor second, B. The fourth one introducing a perfect fourth, C. So creating an AABC form with just intervals, rather than saying, this is like a head chart and I'm going to have an AABA section. You can do that, but this is doing it with intervals instead because this is how it's formed. So the internal intervals of that line as well were basically just informed by the intervals from the piece. So collections of major or minor thirds, and then, well, actually primarily minor thirds, and then occasional major thirds just to accent specific notes to give them a little bit more character. What's interesting about, I guess, also the B section of this theme is that it's an intervallic palindrome. Is everyone familiar with what a palindrome is? Something spelled forward, backwards. So you can see the movement F to E flat, F sharp to E, E flat to C, E natural to D flat, C to A flat, D flat to A. So just spelling back, it's just a neat little thing in the middle of all that. Yeah, I'm going to move kind of quickly just so I don't keep you all here super long. A few other details about the piece was just the majority of the piece was following the introduction is basically just developments of these concepts. So for the case of King Porter 94, we actually only played maybe the first quarter of the piece because generally the rest of the piece is further developments of those ideas. So in the ones that I've shown you so far basically come out of just the first 2 or so minutes of this next piece that we're about to play. But the rest of it were just considerations to those developments and ways to take them forward. So the other thing was that, again, considerations were taken to implement melodic schemes that were more cognizant of the original melody of ho-hum. So there's a few points where you'll explicitly hear ho-hum, but not in the ways that you might be expecting. And then, like what I stated earlier, the chord changes for the trombone solo were taken directly from ho-hum, but recontextualized, so they sound a little bit different. And the last thing I want to talk about before we play this piece is this ending figure. So I kind of call it a celebration of thirds in a way, because if you have it on your sheet, it's a little, I'm sorry about the projector, it's a little hard to see. Essentially the melody is moving in thirds. So the melody note being B flat, G flat, and then the next one, A flat, F, E flat, A flat, F, G flat, E flat. So moving like that in pattern, essentially. Those are 3-bar rhythms. So essentially the Charleston rhythm, the syncopated rhythm that we heard from the first bar of ho-hum, and then just 2 half notes. And then that repeats. So 3 bars, 3 bars, 3 bars. The harmonizing figure underneath in the bass line and the trombones are in groupings of 3 notes as well. So it comes in on that initial A flat and then follows the same chromatic movement from the first statement of the piece, but moving in groupings of 3. So 3 notes, 3 beats, 3 beats, 3 beats. And it's 3 groupings of that to get to the resolution, which is this kind of dissonant chord at the end, which are the consequence of all these moving lines. And then finally at the last note is when we get a D flat, where we actually give definition to the piece. So this is HH22. I wrote it last year. Sorry, real quick, because I'm gonna forget. I have to say a lot of thank yous. This is my last recital here at Eastman, and I've been here for 5 years. And I feel like it's very easy to just keep going and keep talking about the things that you like. So let me say a few thank yous. First off, a huge thank you to my family. None of them are here. They're all in California and Maine and wherever else. But thank you to all of them for supporting me through all this. A massive thank you to all my friends, all the members of the band here. It's just for being amazing during all of these different recitals and everything like that. A tremendous thank you to the JCM faculty, so Darius, Christine, Dave, Chris, JCM, Chris, and Mark. And Mark, just thank you so much for literally everything. Yeah, it's been a wild ride. It's been 5 years. So I think that's it. I'm probably forgetting something, but we're going to move on because I don't want to keep you all here really late. So this is HH22. I think we can open it up for some questions now as well. So if you have a question, feel free to just raise your hand.
This would be nice. I could probably start since we're kind of supposed to get you going on some questions. First of all, congratulations on all the hard work. It's really good. I just spoke up because when I hear Brookmeyer's music, I can hear the history and the freshness at the same time.
Yeah.
That's such magical music, right? And maybe you could speak just a little bit about how you could sort of hear the inklings of all his growth and development as he evolved as a player from earlier in his period. How did some of that inform his evolution, sort of his ability to be such a great scientific developer and the ways he improvises?
Yeah, actually, I think a lot of that comes from his improvisations as well. So the reason why I really got into Brookmeyer at first was because of the improvisations. Specifically, the Brookmeyer quartet that he recorded in it was France, the one with Chris Gossens. I heard that in high school and I just got really into it. But what I think is interesting with Brookmeyer's playing is that there's a period of time early on, when he's still living in New York before he moved to Los Angeles, that you can hear a lot of clarity in his sound, but it's older. But it's kind of the same ideas about intervallic development and same rhythmic ideas. But then later on, especially there's this album called Through the Looking Glass with Mel Lewis and Dick Oates, and it's amazing. But it's him a little bit older. I think it's like the early 70s. And it's this totally new version of his playing that's based on development. But it still sounds like the same ideas, just a new kind of evolution, a new understanding of them. Right. So I think the way that informs a lot of his composition was, there's this great quote in your book where he says that everyone should still keep playing or something like that. And you can hear his playing in his writing, I feel, a lot of times, where it's just this development of ideas rather than just like, I'm gonna play all the stuff I know. It's how can I fit what's going on? So. I'm not sure if that answers.
No, that does. That's exactly what I was thinking about, and I like that you put your own personal attraction to it. And the other thing I was going to ask you about, because I think that's really what I was after, sort of is what you just described. Also, I'm just really impressed with the way he understands instruments, and you can tell that he played piano, and he writes so well for all the instruments. You can tell that it's just apparent that the way he orchestrates and arranges is right on that. Do you have any sort of thoughts about that as a writer yourself?
Yeah, there's some elements of his writing that does remind me of Gil Evans a little bit, just in terms of his orchestration and just in terms of his, I guess, treatment of instruments, not necessarily an orchestrational aspect, but like where they're used. So when I think of, for example, the key thing that I think of when I think of his Noir Orchestra is the lead trumpet, is the first thing, because it has so much melodic clarity and so much is in that chair. So that's like a guiding principle, and the rest of it is support. But when I think about, like, for example, I love the Metropole album with the Metropole Orchestra, and that just shows so much ingenuity with not only the way that the instruments are used, but the ways that they can be arranged and orchestrated in voicings. And I think a lot of that has to do with his piano playing as well. There's this great album, it's called Ivory Hunters. It's him and Bill Evans. Mm-hmm. That's just like, you can tell that they're different players, but it's just like, oh wow, they're both really good. And it has a lot to do, I think, with just the ingenuity of voicings and the ingenuity of like actually understanding where things can be placed. So for example, in Ho Hum, there's a part where all the trombones are pedal B flat, right? Like and it's just like, you sometimes just put that in a bass trombone thing, but it's just like, no, they can all do it. So do it. And it sounds cool, rather than just like, oh, these are going to stay here and this is going to move there. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Very nice. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Wonderful job on that. And one of the things you said that really resonated for me when you said something along the lines of having a knowledge and appreciation for the way the manner in which he studying and having a knowledge of the way he takes things apart is great. But then what I feel you've done so well is you've actually implemented those things. Yeah, which is really, really great. So thank you for that. So you talked a little bit about how the you used was his butchering of his word, of arrangements of standard Great American Songbook tunes or other standards. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about some of those arrangements that you did?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind, it's Willowy for me. Am I getting that right? Sorry, it's late on a Friday night. I remember, I'll give you a personal thing. When I first heard it, I hated it. And it's like one of his more famous arrangements. And it took me a while, and then realizing like, oh, this is actually really cool. Like there's a lot of things going on here that's really cool. And then same things that kind of lead into his different ideas about, I guess, recomposition rather than arrangement. For example, there's an arrangement of My Funny Valentine that there's a YouTube video of the rehearsals up now. You sent me that, right? Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, there's a with him rehearsing with the Vanguard, and it's just totally taken apart and totally everything. You can still kind of hear that My Funny Valentine is there, but I think I can understand why people have a reception of like, that's just a bastardization of it in some ways. But like, I said butchery because in the book it actually says the other word. So like, it seems like it's in the sense of not necessarily taking a standard as like, oh, it's a pretty My Funny Valentine, but rather like I'm going to give what I can and how I feel about this music. And I think that's where people kind of drew the line sometimes. But once you get into that literature more, I think it's a lot more clear about kind of the beauty inside of it.
Yeah, like if you're expecting like an 8-bar intro, harmonization of the head, solos, a shout chorus, and then going home again, you're going to be disappointed because it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So having an appreciation for that and people having quite frankly a greater sense of expectation, I think is really important. I think you maybe did it unintentionally, but you mentioned John Cage's name. I think you're talking about minimalism.
Yeah, like minimalism.
Yeah. Can you talk a little about?
Oh, I was just referring to like just repeated rhythms, I guess.
Okay.
So like, kind of the aspect of when you hear something in a different context from what it's normally in, even if it's the same thing, it's different. So I guess like, in some minimalist music, it can be just repeated notes. So Steve Reich is probably a better example than that. But repeated notes over 40 minutes is going to sound the same, but you put it in a different hall, it's going to sound different. You put a different drone behind it, it's going to sound different. So in the case of this, there's a repeated D flat going into the trumpet solo as the same, in almost verbatim, the same rhythm as the D flat that was repeated in Ho Hum before the trombone solo. The D flat in Ho Hum was by itself entirely. In this piece, it was with a chromatically moving bass line underneath. So and it was orchestrated differently too. So it had a different context that gave it meaning rather than just a repeated figure.
Right.
So
cool. Great. Thank you.
Great job. So my question would be, and we've talked about this, and everybody maybe knows to know about Brookmeyer, but his view, he changed the hierarchy of that we normally like. What are the changes? Is how jazz people usually think about playing or composition, and he kind of reversed it to more of the classical side of things where pitch is paramount. So the theme is the first thing, and then rhythm is second, and harmony is third. So even though he was all about pitch being primary, I'm curious about what you've taken rhythmically from Bob, which I think is, he also had quite a bit of innovation there that maybe flies a little under the radar. So can you talk a little bit about what you feel like you've taken from him rhythmically?
yeah, the first thing I think about is the simplest, which is just sometimes less is more. So for an instance of KP90 of Ho Hum, just the trombone hits, like it doesn't need to be a whole figure behind it. It can be just one thing. The other thing I think about is the thing I've kind of glossed over was essentially developments of rhythm and where they're placed, rather than, for example, like an ostinato, like a repeated figure of a bass line, the Charleston rhythm thing. It doesn't have to just be on one every time. It can actually developing. So 1 and a 4, 4 and a 3, 3. And then 1 again, so that way it's like a totally different thing, or 1 on the bar before where it normally pops up. So using that development of rhythm to create 5-bar phrases, 7-bar phrases, rather than just strictly speaking 4-bar phrases. Then the other thing that probably pertained most to this piece was the idea of flow. So for example, in KP94, that's all flow to me with those initial melodies, where it's just this constant, it's like repeated eighth notes, but it's less, to me, it's less of the idea of just like da 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 da. It's like, how can this line sound organic with like kind of almost a static rhythm, but actually flowing and building momentum with rhythm through development, and then also through kind of finding the good places for syncopations and the kind of the good beats, I guess. So in the case of this, all these figures start at different points. So the first two figures starting on the end of 3, the third one starting on the end of 2, end of 3, end of 4, 2. So, but they all have the same amount of notes, but they all have different places where they can start, so they can keep that flow rather than just sounding like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So displacement, I guess, is the word.
I just heard an interview with Steve Gadd. That's what he's obsessed with right now, is displacement.
Yeah.
But it's funny too, because I was just thinking about the rhythm of the clave. That New Orleans is the northernmost tip of the Caribbean, right? And how in that rhythm is the clave. And that's another thing that keeps it rooted, I think. That repetition of that the Charleston comes out of that that street beat and all the clave influence on the jazz rhythms like the Charleston.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when that does get developed, though, more so. Specifically in KP94, where it's taking just the first part of that rhythm, so the dotted quarter note, and pulling it further and further.
Yeah, right.
And for me, oddly enough, I actually grew up with a Latin music background, so when I think of clave, the way I was taught it wasn't necessarily think of it as like a rhythmic mode or anything like that. It's all polyrhythmic. Right. Like every aspect of clave being polyrhythmic. So it's like first like a 3/2 clave, being able to play a 3/2 clave starting on the downbeat, keeping it going on the end of 1, starting it on 2, on the end of 2, and feeling the subdivisions of the beat within a clave, but the clave is informing parts of the beat rather than just it's on. Like moving every part of it. Yeah. So that's why I think I really am attracted to some of the parts with, the Charleston rhythm is just entirely either augmented or just repeated, because it's still able to retain that downbeat.
Cool.
Great, thanks.
Cool. Are there any other questions, or we good? Awesome. It's 9:15 Friday night. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate all of your support and all of your time. Thank you so much. Have a great night.